But I want to thank John and Allison and all the staff here for inviting me back. Can everybody hear me all right?
Fine.
I'm going to speak to you for a few minutes, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'm going to show you some slides. So that's just to prepare you for how it's going to go. When I was about 12, my grandmother told me that she had seen Santa Claus one Christmas Eve night. Or at least she had seen his legs and his boots as he disappeared up the chimney in our house. The picture she painted was so vivid that I believed her, and I remained for at least another year one of the only non-cynics in my school. Hadn't I myself heard the pawing of reindeer hoofs on the roof of our house? And hadn't my sister Jean as well? Plus, there had been handwritten notes from him each Christmas morning next to the graham cracker crumbs and mostly finished milk that we left out in order to fuel him up. But probably what made him so real to me was my father's annual reading of a visit from St. Nicholas. That took place at the climax of every Christmas Eve after the creches had been displayed and after the 8-foot-tall tree had been decorated and lit up, and the Santa Claus dolls with their rubber noses or wind-up music box noses had been lifted lovingly out of their year-long wrappings. It took place after green and red stockings had been hung, and carols had been sung, and church had been attended, and notes had been written and burned in the fireplace so that the messages might fly upwards in the smoke. And it took place after the gold handmade star had been hung on the tippiest top of the tree by the tiniest of the 4 or 5 or finally 6 children, depending on which year it was. And then with all of us in our cozy pajamas or nightgowns and our presents under the tree, then it was that our father would nestle us about him on the big green couch, our mother standing ever so close by, and read to us our Christmas story, our Christmas poem. We didn't know that this same family ritual was proceeding in homes all across the land, the fatherly reading of a peculiarly American poem which has made St. Nicholas live on in our history. We like to think that a beloved holiday such as Christmas has always been thus, that in it we enter a kind of timeless space of tradition and meaning and goodwill that links us to earlier, simpler times before the onslaught of modern life and its intensive commercialization. But as John has reminded us, and as those who have really intensively studied the history of this holiday have taught us, Christmas is actually a relatively recent invention in the United States. The Pilgrims and Puritans who settled New England brought with them a distaste for the day that was palpable. The December 25th holiday had no biblical mandate, they insisted, but coincided with ancient rites surrounding the winter solstice. At best, it was a thin veneer over an essentially pagan festival. At Christmas time back in England, they said, all hell regularly broke loose as people with too much spare time on their hands and newly brewed beer took to a carnival season of feasting and frolicking. In wealthy homes, great bouts of eating took place, including the ceremonial presentation of the boar's head or the peacock pie. In an old druidic custom, mistletoe was hung up over the doorways to justify stolen kisses, and wealthy estate owners were expected to hand out free food and ale to anyone coming to their doors in a tradition called wassailing. And then there was the deeply suspicious tradition of mumming, where at Christmas time men and women donned each other's clothing as well as masks and went around to neighbors' houses to make merry in disguise. During this season, normal etiquettes were laid aside, and were replaced by widespread drunkenness and abandon, all under the direction of the so-called Lord of Misrule. Historians have determined that bulges in the numbers of births in September and October in 18th and 19th century England prove that sexual liaisons rose to their heights during the Christmas season. English Puritan William Prynne spoke of the stupendous height of pagan impiety that surrounded the holiday, and said that Christmas should be a day of mourning, not of rejoicing. In William Bradford's Massachusetts, Christmas became an outlawed holiday, and remained so for more than a century. Cotton Mather in Boston in 1711 included Christmas on a blacklist of evil customs which had begun to appear among us. Christmas revelry, he wrote, was beginning to be taken up more and more, and especially among the young people in our towns. In the American colonies, there was always a difference, of course, between Puritan New England and more Anglican places such as Virginia and elsewhere. But nowhere in this entire country before 1810 was there any kind of real Christmas holiday. And then things began to change. And it began not with the churches, but with a group of creative gentry in New York City, known affectionately as the Knickerbockers. One of the most determined of these was a local merchant named John Kunhardt, a lover of historical tradition and holiday rituals, and founder of the New York Historical Society. In the early 19th century, there were essentially just 3 American holidays. There was Thanksgiving, of course, there was 4th of July after the Revolution, and there was New Year's Day, or New Year's Eve and Day. But there was no Christmas. And to someone like John Kunhardt, this just wasn't enough holidays. He became actually active in the years ahead in trying to get Washington's birthday onto the calendar, and also Columbus Day. But his favorite of all his holidays was St. Nicholas's Day, December 6th, which was virtually unrecognized in this country at the time. And he also was interested in helping to forge a kind of non-British identity for America. He knew that the United States had a Dutch origin, and he also knew that the Dutch had a very strong tradition of St. Nicholas. And so he began to organize St. Nicholas Day celebrations. He also launched an effort to make St. Nicholas into the patron saint of New York City. And in 1810, he published a widely distributed broadside etched by one of the country's leading engravers. I'll show it to you a little later. It was the first American image of St. Nicholas, and it carried with it some of the old connotations. The actual Nicholas, I'm sure most of you know, was a 4th century bishop in Turkey who had become famous for his generosity. And over the years, he had become widely loved in the East. He became the patron saint of all Russia, for example. Protestants were less easy with him, but in Holland, among the Dutch, there was a tremendous affection for this saint. And beginning in the 17th century, Dutch Protestants in particular elevated St. Nicholas's Day cult to a high degree. This is where the children would leave out their wooden shoes or put out their stockings so that on the eve of his feast day they would get gifts from the saint. But this bishop, Nicholas, was also not just a rewarder, he was also a punisher. And along with his gifts he brought along a whole bunch of whipping sticks. St. Kunhardt's St. Nicholas continued in this tradition. Though not as clerical as in earlier images, this Nicholas was a tall, thin, serious-looking man, adorned in his ecclesiastical vestments. In one panel of the broadside that he produced, 2 children are depicted. One is a happy girl opening up her presents. The other is a little boy weeping. He appears to have been recently whipped. Pintar's chief ally in his project to promote St. Nicholas was the fellow New Yorker and well-known literary figure Washington Irving. In 1809, Irving produced and published a fanciful history of New York. And how many here have ever seen the Knickerbocker's History of New York? Anybody ever read that? It's a wonderful thing. It was written under the pseudonym of Dietrich Knickerbocker, and that's why this group of creative people took on the name of the Knickerbockers. It's also where the name for the New York Knicks came from, if you follow that sports team. In his book, Irving satirized Henry Hudson's 1609 voyage into the New World for the Dutch East India Company. And he depicted his ship sailing from Amsterdam into the New World. And on the bow of that ship, he said there was a great wooden carved head of St. Nicholas with his three-brimmed hat and a long clay pipe coming out of his mouth. And it was said that Hudson's voyage was particularly successful because he was under the care of the ever-revered St. Nicholas. And that it was he, along with the god Neptune, he added, who guided them to the very spot where they would establish the new Dutch settlement. Under the leadership of one Olaf van Cortlandt, a band of Dutchmen from Hudson's ship set out to explore the New Jersey coast, and they were blown off course to the southern tip of Manhattan Island. There, Olaf dreamed a dream, and in it, Irving writes, the good St. Nicholas came riding over the tops of the trees in that self-same wagon wherein he brings his yearly presents to children. So this saint joins them by the fire, and the dream goes on. Olaf recognizes him by his hat and his long pipe. Nicholas sits down. The smoke from the pipe encircles his head, and then it goes out and spreads out like a cloud to quite a distance. And the saint says, as far as the smoke goes, so shall you declare to be the limits of your new settlement. When he finishes talking, Nicholas twists his pipe into his hat band and then, quote, laying his finger beside of his nose and giving a wink, mounted his wagon and returned over the treetops and disappeared. Well, you can already hear the echoes. Here, of course, is an essential background to the great Christmas poem that would be written just 13 years later by another member of the Knickerbocker group, Clement Clark Moore. But before I get to him, let me say there was another passage in Irving's History of New York that described in a satirical way New Amsterdam's first governor, whom he named Walter Van Twiller. Unlike the skinny St. Nicholas, Van Twiller was portrayed as a short, rotund Dutchman, bigger around the waist than he was high. Irving described his round belly, his twinkling eyes, his full cheeks, his mouth as red as an apple. Like Nicholas and most Dutchmen, he was a committed pipe smoker, and the smoke from his long pipe curled over his head all the way to the ceiling. When engaged in thought, he, quote, spoke not a word. And when departing, he too laid his finger beside his nose. In the second edition of his book, published in 1812, Irving described a controversy that had supposedly erupted in early New Amsterdam over the smoking of long pipes. As the scholar Stephen Nussbaum has brilliantly chronicled, it turns out that long pipes were the mark of aristocracy and of leisure. It was decided in Irving's story that there should be no place for long pipes in the busy new colony of New Amsterdam, and that only short pipes would be now permitted, pipes that would not get in your way while you worked. And this led to a kind of class war. Irving humorously narrated, between the so-called long pipes and the short pipes, a class distinction that continued into Irving's own day. Well, Clement Clark Moore was decidedly of the long pipe party, one of the richest men in New York in 1820. His father, Benjamin, was the second Episcopal Bishop of New York, and in 1789 had helped swear in the new president, George Washington. Through his marriage to Charity Clark, Bishop Moore had inherited a sprawling farm north of what was then the city of New York. It was an estate that stretched from the Hudson River all the way east to what is now 9th Avenue, and north about the distance of 4 of today's city blocks. It's a huge farm. It was named Chelsea after that section of London. And of course, those of you who know New York know of the large section of the city known today as Chelsea. In those days, it contained apple orchards and pastures and a beautiful large house where Clement Clark was born in July of 1779. Trips out of the Moore house in winter were often by horse and sleigh, and it may have been on one such excursion on a moonlit December night, sometime before Christmas 1822, that Clement Moore conceived his Christmas poem. In addition to his friend Washington Irving's writings, Moore had other literary sources to draw upon. In years prior, St. Nicholas had been pictured as an emaciated moralist, a good but frightening bishop, bearing gifts but also his scary rod. Earlier poems had stressed this twofold nature. One poem published in The Spectator in December 1815 included these lines: "Oh, leave not the famous big cookie behind, or if in your hurry one thing you mislay, let it be the rod, and oh, keep it away." Another poem called The Children's Friend was published anonymously in 1821, the year before Moore wrote his poem. And it had Santa Claus driving a sleigh with a single reindeer and delivering a sober Christmas message. "Where'er I found good girls and boys that hated quarrels, strife, and noise, I left an apple or a tart, or wooden gun, or painted cart. But when I found the children naughty, in manners rude, in tempers haughty, thankless to parents, liars, swearers, boxers, cheats, or base tale-tellers, I left a long black birchen rod, such as the dread command of God directs a parent's hand to use when virtue's path his sons refuse." Besides being a remnant of Christian orthodoxy, here was a clear reflection of the child-rearing philosophy of the day, when whippings were an accepted part of disciplining bad behavior. Santa Claus could clearly be seen as a parental ally in this regard. He could help put fear into children's hearts and make them try harder to be good. But Clement Clark Moore utterly rejected this philosophy. And in a revolutionary effort to forge a truly American Christmas, he decided to transform the figure of St. Nicholas himself. His Santa Claus would not be the thin bishop of European tradition, parceling out reward and punishment. Moore would model him instead on the roly-poly governor of Irving's fictional Manhattan, or alternatively, as he stated later in an 1863 interview, on a portly, rubicund Dutchman who had lived near his father in New York City. Moore's Santa was to be a thoroughly benign figure. The children in Moore's poem already know this new Saint Nick. It's as if they have always known him. They go to their snug sleep, nearly bursting with hopes for his arrival, their heads dancing with Christmas visions. It's the father of the household, if you think back to the poem, who I think is a stand-in for Moore himself, who discovers the night visitor and his team of 8 reindeer, clattering across the snow-covered lawn in front of the house, a great moon lighting up the scene as if it were midday. He recognizes him at once as the old elf, as he's described, whistles and shouts to a team of reindeer he obviously adores. Unlike the tall bishop, this Nicholas is small. He drives a, quote, miniature sleigh and pulls 8 tiny reindeer. Even as he invades homes like a night prowler, his very smallness makes him extremely unthreatening. And he comes not like wassailers demanding gifts and ale, but as a pure gift giver. Interestingly, Moore Santa is not an aristocrat like himself. He's a rough-hewn common man of the people. His bundle of toys strapped to his back makes him look like a peddler just opening his pack. And unlike Irving's Nicholas with his long aristocratic pipe, this Santa is clearly a working man. The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth, and the smoke it encircled his head like a wreath. Here, of course, is a return to Olaf's dream of that magical visitor who comes out of the sky to bestow good fortune. But now he is truly an everyman, a visitor that any American might wish to welcome into his or her home. He's funny to look at, a right jolly old elf who makes Father laugh out loud in spite of himself. He's plump and jolly. His eyes twinkle beneath the snow-wreathed head. The dimples are merry. The cheeks look like roses. The nose is like a cherry. Most importantly, no longer does he bring with him that dreaded rod. Instead, he winks and lets us know we have nothing to dread. There's no two-tiered system here. No toys for some, birch rods for others. All the children are to be loved this night by this new incarnation of Christmas. Like the old Dutch governor, he speaks not a word, but goes straight to his work. He fills the stockings and he turns with a jerk, and then laying a finger aside of his nose and giving a nod up the chimney, he rose. And of course, his final words spoken as he drives out of sight are happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night. It was a truly universalistic message. And as it came along with a new vision of childhood in America, instead of a puritanical reward and punishment system, parents were invited to shower their children with love, in the belief that love will make them into loving people. In his marvelous book, Battling for Christmas, historian Stephen Nussbaum equates Moore's poem with a new kind of pedagogy that was sweeping into America beginning in the 1820s and 30s. It was embraced not only by the Knickerbockers in New York, but by the Unitarians of New England, long in conflict with the Puritans, and by the Pennsylvania Dutch as well. It led to the invention of another new Christmas tradition, that of, this time with German roots, that of the Christmas tree, hitherto unknown in America. It involved a new kind of Christmas. This family, a new kind of Christmas rite, the family gathering around, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I don't understand your question. They're coming at the end, yeah. I'm sorry, I just had a question of whether I was going to show my images, but they'll very, very soon. I'm just going to finish my opening remarks. The Christmas tree tradition had hitherto been unknown in this country. And it involved a new kind of Christmas rite, which was the family gathering around the lit tree for the giving and receiving of presents. By the 1840s, all these new traditions were starting to coalesce, and by the 1860s, they were everywhere. In the drawings of Thomas Nast, the German-born illustrator, Santa Claus himself became widely known and increasingly standardized. In his earliest drawings, Nast depicted him much as Moore had described him: scruffy, small, holding that stump of a pipe in his teeth. But gradually, Nast's Santa began to evolve. He visited Civil War soldiers, he supported the Union cause, he slowly but surely began to physically grow. And in Nast's most famous, mature depiction, he's no longer a plebeian. His short pipe has grown long again, and he has the appearance of prosperity. But never again was he to return to that stern old bishop. He remained a jolly, all-loving, benevolent spirit, which is what he has been for us ever since. And so we continue all these traditions. We put up trees in our homes, we hang up stockings, and many of us read A Visit from St. Nicholas. And as we do so, I hope that from here on in we'll nod our heads and give a wink to those creative figures of the 19th century who humanized and transfigured American Christmas. So those are my opening remarks. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm now going to show you some. I could have integrated these with my talk, but I want to take a little time to show you some of how this unfolded visually in our country's history. And so this will continue now as a kind of illustrated lecture. A Visit from St. Nicholas. This is one of the early covers of one of the early books as the poem became a book form and was published in our history. This poem has been called by some America's most beloved poem. I grew up with it in my father's reading of it every year, as I said. I found this old picture taken from 1952 when we lived in California. Puritans had long despised the old British custom of Christmas revelry, when men and women gave themselves, as I told you, over to what they called the Lord of Misrule. This is an early depiction of one such revelry. In this marvelous American painting from about 1850 entitled The Christmas Party, you can see a kind of old-fashioned Christmas revelry of the British kind. You can see the marvelous havoc taking place in the room. Puritans didn't like this kind of fun. This is John Kunhardt, the great promoter of St. Nicholas, as the new patron saint of New York City and of Christmas. Nicholas had long been the official property of the church. Here he was presented in an Italian fresco from the 14th century. This one is by the 16th century German engraver Albrecht Dürer. Up until Clement Moore, Nicholas was a decidedly ecclesiastical figure. Here he is in Kunhardt's American broadside that I mentioned to you from 1810. He's a bit softer and more human than in the past, but he's still very much a bishop. The broadside had a series of panels as well as a poem that ended with these words: "St. Nicholas, my dear good friend, to serve you ever was my end. If you will now me something give, and I'll serve you ever while I live." You can see to the right of the broadside were those two panels or drawings I mentioned. One of them, the one below, showed stockings hung by the fireplace. One on the left you see is stuffed with toys. The other one contains those switches. And here's the little girl and boy. She's happy. But he's got one of those stitches given to him, those switches. Here are, this is Washington Irving. This is a wonderful photograph taken in the 1840s by Matthew Brady. I had a larger version of it as well, but that's good enough. And here are some examples of some Dutch pipe smokers. This storekeeper is smoking a long pipe. He's more prosperous. As you got more prosperous, the pipe got longer. This man has a very long one. And here's an example of a poor woman smoking a short pipe. And this next one is one of my favorite illustrations. It was actually used as the frontispiece to Irving's Knickerbocker History. As Stephen Nussbaum pointed out, you can see there are 4 men in the front of the drawing. They all have very long pipes. These are men of leisure, gentlemen. But in the very back, you can see the tavern keeper himself who's coming in, and he's smoking a short pipe. Interestingly also, if you look how that Dutchman there is putting his finger to his nose. This seems to have been, we don't think of this anymore as a gesture that we're familiar with, but it seems to have been a well-known and kind of mischievous gesture in this period, indicating something droll or fanciful. And you can see the man across from him is roaring with laughter at something the fat man has just said. When Clement Moore's St. Nicholas laid a finger beside his nose, he seems to have been inviting us into a kind of magical sphere of benign trickery. Here is the first Santa Claus depicted in America from the little book, The Children's Friend. It appeared just 1 year before the St. Nicholas Moore wrote his poem. We don't know the author. It was published anonymously. But he's now, for the first time, calls St. Nick Santa Claus, and he's taken the traditional wagon, horse-drawn wagon that he was riding in from ancient tradition, and in this case, he pulls a sleigh pulled by a single reindeer. This is where the reindeer tradition came from. Here he is in that same book. He's kindly looking. He's called Santa Claus, but he still has that rod. And in the words below his head, it says, the steady friend of virtuous youth. Here's Clement Clark Moore as he looked about the time he wrote his soon-to-be famous poem. And here, he wrote it right here in this house. It's called Chelsea House. This wonderful watercolor was painted by his daughter, Mary. Moore wrote the poem, by the way, for his 6 children. And he first read it to them on Christmas Eve, 1822. The following year, it was published anonymously in the Troy Sentinel, and Moore wasn't publicly credited with its authorship until 1837, but he went on to include it in a published anthology of his poetry in 1844. Here is the first illustrated version of the poem, an 1843 edition that Moore seems to have approved. It had original woodcuts in it by T.C. Boyd. Here were the children snug in their beds, and St. Nicholas arriving to the quite urban neighborhood in his tiny sleigh. Look how little those reindeer are. You can see the city buildings as he climbs into the chimney. The artist has remained faithful to Moore's description. Notice his peddler-like appearance, his short pipe with the smoke arising, his fur jacket and cap, and the sack of toys on his back. He was also very small, so short he needed a chair to fill the stockings. So this is how he looked in 1843, Moore still alive and contributing to the artist's conception. Just 14 years later, he looked like this. This is from Harper's Weekly, which was really the kind of life magazine of the 19th century. Santa now is sitting in his house of snow. You can see in the background his elves are hard at work. And note that his pipe has gotten longer. He's smoking a long pipe. Somebody hasn't been faithful to that part of the tradition. The following year, a young immigrant from Germany named Thomas Nast began to submit his drawings to Harper's Weekly. And Nast was coming of age at a time as the Civil War was breaking out. He became a major contributor of pro-Union depictions. By Christmas 1862, he had started to draw St. Nicholas. Here was Santa on the magazine's cover, visiting Union soldiers in the field, delivering presents to them. This was Nast's first rendering of Santa Claus. He's wearing the Union flag for a coat, and he holds out a toy figure of Jefferson Davis, which he operates like a puppet. In that same issue of Harper's, Nast also contributed this, an emotional rendering of a war-separated husband and wife, he out on the cold fields of battle, she watching over the children and tending the home fires. If you look very closely at the upper corners of the drawing, you can see two tiny depictions of Santa Claus. Here he is on the roof of their home, about to enter. And here he is out with the soldiers, delivering them presents. So the following year at Christmas time, 1863, Nast contributed this triptych. It too depicted Santa, very peddler-like, much as Clement Moore depicted him, making a secret visit to the children's bedroom. It also showed the children the next morning opening their toys. And it showed mother and father reuniting. By 1865, this is how Santa had evolved in one of Nast's finest renderings. Notice how his pipe has grown long again. And here it is in a rare color version. Nast went on to illustrate an 1869 edition of Moore's Christmas poem. Here are some of the pages he drew. The hanging of the stockings, Santa arriving on the moonlit snow, climbing into the chimney, the unpacking of his toys, and finally, his departure with his loving farewell, leaving behind the next morning a group of happy children. As Nast grew older, his Santa Claus kept evolving. Here he is, still loving to draw Santa Claus. It was he who gave Santa a home at the North Pole, invented Mrs. Claus, and depicted him as a toy maker. And here is the Santa who's probably the most famous of the Nast renditions. The pipe has become very long. The beard is patrician, but there's nothing scary or judgmental about him. I want to show you a few early Christmas tree pictures just before I end. This one is a sketch from 1819 showing a Pennsylvania Dutch family with their German-inspired Christmas tree. It's the earliest such depiction in American history. And here is the first image of a Christmas tree in an American book, published book, written by a German-born professor at Harvard in 1836. By 1848, Prince Albert and his family had a Christmas tree in Windsor Castle, and 1 year later, the same image was adapted by a women's magazine in the United States to depict an American family Christmas. Just as Santa was evolving in this period, so was the Christmas tree tradition. Christmas trees appeared in Civil War camps in the 1860s, as depicted here by the artist Winslow Homer. Homer also sketched this scene for Harper's Weekly, the new American tradition of cutting your own tree. In this photograph, you can see you can see the greens cut for a Civil War hospital began having Christmas trees in it. And in this picture, President Lincoln is appearing in Harper's for Christmas 1864, inviting Confederate soldiers to join in a great Christmas banquet at the White House. By the post-war period, Christmas was being celebrated all across the country, even in some Jewish homes. Later, American Jews began to question whether it was proper to join in the celebration of such a holiday. But even so, Christmas was becoming ever more secular and widespread. Shopping for trees became a part of the festivities, as also Christmas shopping for gifts became more and more elaborate. Here in 1881, a family gathers around their tree. Christmas was now a domestic ritual of family affection. New editions of Clement Clarke's Moore poem were published, as this fine one by the McLaughlin brothers in 1896. I'll just flip through it for you. And here is a picture of the great Christmas tree set up in Chelsea Square in New York City, right near the spot of Clement Moore's home. Christmas trees were now photographed in many places: at an orphan's home, in a hospital, inside a men's prison. Here is the Santa of modern times. This is famous. This was a Coca-Cola ad from the 1930s, and Coca-Cola claims to have really invented the image of the modern Santa Claus. This is very similar to what we think of today. So many people complain that Christmas has become too commercialized, but they should remember that Santa was used in advertising even as early as the 1840s. This fine etching from 1841 was used the following year to advertise dry goods at Pease's Variety Store in Albany. Anyway, I close with just a few snapshots from my own family history. I wanted to blow this up, but it's not going to be big enough. But there's my father with his brother Ken and sisters Nancy and Edith. They've just cut their own Christmas tree near their home in rural New Jersey. My father's the one holding the saw. His father smoked a short pipe, and he loved Christmas dearly. My father continued the Christmas traditions in Santa Monica, California, where I spent my first 7 years. Each Christmas, his parents would cut a little tree on their hill and ship it out to my mother and father in California. And here I am as a small child opening my stocking and riding on my new Christmas horse. For me, Christmas has always been a time of special magic, and not least because of the Christmas poem by Clement Clarke Moore. Thank you very much. I'd be glad to answer a question or two if we'd like to do that. I see a hand up. Yes.
Was Christmas always celebrated? How did it get to be the 25th versus the 6th?
That's a good point. I didn't really get into that in my lecture. The 25th had long been the official church date for Christmas. Established. I can't tell you the exact year that date was settled upon. It was sometime centuries after the events it narrated. Christmas for a long time migrated around the calendar, and it sometimes was a spring or a summer festival in the earliest centuries. But eventually a church council picked this date, and it was believed that, we think in part, to, in a sense, subsume a very popular pagan festival or non-church festival centered around the winter solstice, known as Sol Invictus, the invincible sun, a time of great feasting and rejoicing at the darkest day of the year. And there was such popular interest in that holiday that the church wanted to kind of tap into it. and chose to Christianize it, if you will, and chose that date. This is partly why the Puritans objected to it. They thought it was too arbitrary, it didn't have mandate in the ancient times, and so they resisted it. But as I said, it's very interesting in American history that December 6th was the date. The St. Nicholas date was for many years the date when parents would have their so-called Christmas celebrations, and it only gradually shifted to December 25th. In fact, for a time it also shifted to New Year's Eve. One version of Clement Moore's poem, actually, it was published very early, it was the night before New Year's, and all through the house. So it took a time until December 25th and 4th, the eve of Christmas, all these traditions began to settle on that one date. Thank you. Any other questions? I'd be glad to.
One back here, Phil.
Yes.
I did not pick up in your lecture where the day was changed from St. Nicholas Day to Christmas Day, Christmas Day.
Yes, well, that was what I was just trying to talk about a little bit. St. Nicholas Day continued on. It's still observed in some quarters. Today is St. Nicholas Day, if you will, and we're lighting the Christmas tree. So the two traditions have been linked together. And as I said, for a long time, December 6th was a much bigger and more important festival than the 25th. And if you go through John Pintar's letters and read them to his family letters, you'll see that some years they celebrated it December 6th, some years on December 31st.
No, not the date. The name of the day today is Christmas Day in this country.
Ah, yes.
So where did that come from?
Yes, okay. Well, Christmas was the old name for the date, Christ's Mass, or it was the great Eucharist of Christmas. However, Moore's poem was called a Visit from St. Nicholas. And we know it today more as the night before Christmas. But it was, Moore never called it that. And I think I can't tell you exactly when our use of that changed, but increasingly the Christmas was the emphasis and not Nicholas himself.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes. Thanks for explaining where my mother got the threats about switches.
Yeah.
What about the threats she had about lumps of coal? Where did that come from?
I almost put in lumps of coal as well. That was kind of a variant of the switches that I can't give you an exact source for that. I'll have to go back and do some more research. But yes, at some point that came out of that same tradition of the bad boys and girls would find not an orange in the bottom of their stocking, but a lump of coal, and they would still get their toys. So it was a little bit of a modification of the switches. They would get their toys, but when they got to the bottom, instead of a nice plump orange, they would find this coal. It would remind them that they had to be a little better next year. Interestingly, the orange, I don't know if some of you grew up having oranges in your stockings or continue that tradition. Some families use tangerines or other things, but in fact, there was a meaning behind that, and it goes back to the House of Orange, which was part of the Protestant tradition that the Knickerbockers related to. Other questions? Anybody else? Well, I hope that you have a marvelous holiday season, whatever your tradition is. Christmas, in this new humanized sense, can belong to all of us, and it should be a time of peace and goodwill and love. So I wish that to all of you this season. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. You explained a lot of things for me. It's terrific. I appreciate it. Thank you all for being here today on this St. Nicholas Day. And as I mentioned earlier, we will light the tree just before 5 o'clock. And the great-grandchildren in Flagler will do the honors for us. In the meantime, you can hear the organ play in the music room. You have, I hope, you received as you came in today, a list of the events for the day, times when the organ will be played, times when the Model B Steinway piano in the drawing room will be played. There's even the time listed when Santa will be in the pavilion handing out presents to children, and so on. And of course, there'll be refreshments in the West Room, which begin I think, about this time. So I want to release you now to enjoy the rest of the afternoon here at the museum. Thank you for coming. We wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.